just thinking about this whole transition that we have in the industry, moving towards a more sustainable future. Obviously, electric vehicles is part of that, but it would seem pretty illogical that we're making electric vehicles without having a supply chain. So I think, when we think about the impact that we have from a Canadian perspective on the industry more generally, I think this can be, another competitive edge that Canada has as we sort of look to the future and the transformation that's happening. Maybe we'll start with a question for Simon. Sort of starting at a high level, I think, thinking about strategy, and maybe you can share some of the elements from a strategy perspective that were considered as it relates to batteries.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really not good with mics, but I'll try to do my best. But thanks a lot for this question. I think first and foremost, from our standpoint in Quebec, it's also important to understand where we are actually, how we are positioned tackling that question, actually. It's very different in Quebec versus Ontario in terms of how we position ourselves, and actually even the rest of Canada, how we position ourselves versus this battery strategy. So first and foremost, I think it's important to understand that we actually look at it from a very upstream standpoint. We do not have an automotive industry that we need to save. So on our end, it was really about essentially trying to build that value chain, build that supply chain. So to your question, what are the critical elements actually to build such a supply chain for us was really assessing that question from an upstream standpoint. So first, mineral resources, we had to build on this and providing access to those mineral resources and actually establishing the bridges to connect the mining with ultimately the cell manufacturing. In order to do this, we needed to have all of those very energy intensive parts of the value chain, meaning the cathodes, the anodes. So second elements, of course, was energy mix. And on top of this, then you got to have a lot of planning and strategy on this. So a lot of government support to tackle all of the, what I would call external factors, such as land planning, such as development of industrial land, distribution of power within the territory, access to workforce, housing, kid, everything, childcare. You got to assess all those things and have them all collected together. So ultimately what you have is an industrial policy, actually. So all of the key elements, yes, of course, natural resources, but it was also about connecting all of that together, and most importantly, to your question, doing it in a way that makes us being competitive versus the others and building on that edge of being ESG compliant while also being economically viable. Because if you're just ESG compliant, I'm sorry, I don't think that's enough. Not in this market.
Right. Maybe Ahmed. I know Magna, and I think we have, it's sort of an interesting group of people here, right? We've got strategy, we have sort of, I would call traditional suppliers in the automotive space that are sort of evolving as the industry is changing. We have someone, Kunal here from a, new product development, if you will, and how that fits into things. And then obviously Eva from a recycling and sort of bringing that whole circularity element back into the mix as we, look to what this future is. Magna being a sort of a historical large player in the global automotive sector, would be interesting, Ahmed, to hear from you a little bit about some of the sustainability initiatives that are happening at Magna and sort of how this is all factoring in along this whole sustainability journey.
Yeah, thank you. I would say there's kind of twofold to it. The first half is our own operations. So we've made carbon neutrality commitments for 2025 and 2030 to be carbon neutral. So we really have to examine how are we manufacturing, what is everything happening within our four walls, and how can we change that to significantly decarbonize and very quickly. So in scope 2, looking at renewable energy, and it's not easy depending on the jurisdiction you're in. How do we sign on to these long-term commitments to be able to kind of achieve our goals today in long term and still be competitive? And then looking at natural gas usage, how do you completely decarbonize, which might mean electrification or might mean a plethora of other options, some of your operations. And then also I think what's more exciting is on our product side. This, I think someone mentioned it earlier, it's kind of a chance that we haven't had since the 1800s to really re-look at what is a vehicle and how is it made. And not only is it changing, the powertrain and the drivetrain, but everything else now. So there's a really neat opportunity to take a look at, for example, material specs for a seat foam. It is so challenging to kind of meet some of these specs and still be innovative. But I think right now, our customers are looking to okay, let's re-examine that spec. And is it the right thing for today's world? So some really cool opportunities happening in that space, to looking at seat phone made out of corn husk, which I think 5-10 years ago, if you went to an OEM with that idea, you would have been kicked out the door. So I think it's really cool to see things happening in that space. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we see sustainability, but I'll even take it higher up. I think it's all about also the people that you've got throughout your organization. So right now we have to embed sustainability across every single department, from your designers to your buyers, people in supply chain. And I think one of my most exciting initiatives is a sustainability ambassadors program, which seems like just like a nice to have. It's like a kind of a get together for your employees, but it's much more beyond that. It's how do you kind of get everyone to start thinking, how does my role at Magna or whatever organization they're in, how does it intersect with sustainability? And I'll tell you, every single person in your company does have that intersection with sustainability. So how do you get the people to think in their day-to-day decisions to think about, okay, how is it impacting my long-term commitments at Magna, and how do I play a role with that? Because all these day-to-day decisions come together, and that is your company. So that's kind of been a neat, interesting initiative that we've had that has been really successful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think, having that kind of in a department, if you will, is not the way it's going to work. I think it is that sort of more proliferated in all the decision-making that's happening throughout the company, that's one of the factors that's being considered. Obviously, sometimes, those decisions may not, I think we have to also think about the ways in which, as we're making these decisions, how do we also make sure that what we're doing is sustainable from an economic perspective, right? We can't continue to add costs. I don't think it's something that's going to, advance us from a competitive perspective. And so, trying to find, maybe some offsets in terms of ways to save in other areas to actually compensate for, different decisions that need to be made to kind of meet that long-term objective. Maybe just thinking about, just the evolving landscape, and I think, things keep moving at a fairly quick pace, and I think, ESG is becoming more important. It's not just something that's a nice to have. I think it's sort of an imperative within the industry. I think the customers, I think from a government perspective as well. Rob, maybe just from your perspective, we've got pressures coming from consumers, we've got requirements coming from customers. You also have, I think, this tension from an access to capital perspective in terms of, companies having an appropriate, call it ESG rating, for them to want to be involved from a financing standpoint. Maybe you could just highlight, how some of these sustainability matters are being embedded into company strategy more broadly.
How much time do I have? No, I really like the comments that were stated. I think first thing, you're not in this business unless you're really innovative. And so whether you're traditional or new, the fact is we're seeing innovation all over the place. The industry is changing, and it has changed more in the last 5 years, and will change in the next 5 years more than it has in the previous 50. And that's not just a general statement. So we've got to make those determinations in our strategic planning. And the second element is you've also got to be able to make money. And at the end of the day, a company that doesn't make money is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. We offer job security to our people and opportunity for advancement. And in order to do that, you've got to be competitive. So that underlies our strategic thinking all the time. And I will make one shout out. One of the competitive advantages for us in Canada is a tremendously strong automotive parts industry. And the reality is we can make just about anything. To throw a stat out there, we're 21 years old, and 21 years ago we had no automotive revenues. Today our run rate's about $5 billion. Linamar was $1 billion and something. Today its run rate's about $8 billion. Magna was $13 billion. Today its run rate's about $50 billion. Those are Canadian-based suppliers that have grown elsewhere and in Canada. And you cannot grow in this industry unless you're competitive, and thinking about all those types of things in the context of sustainability. So very briefly, because I know we'll talk about it in different things, we look at all aspects of what we do in order to provide good products for our customers. We're a lightweighting company primarily. We use high-strength steels, we use aluminum, we use them in combination. And the reality is that if you can have a structurally safe vehicle, that is lighter, it'll go farther on an electric charge. It'll have more miles per gallon. There will be less of a greenhouse gas footprint. And that's right at the leading edge of so much. It's one of the leading trends in the automotive industry. And we spend a lot of time thinking about that. And in thinking about that, you're lowering greenhouse gas emissions. You're thinking about how you produce all that stuff. You're working with your people for innovative solutions all the time. And to me, it's not so much an ESG index. I get it. But at the end of the day, in order to be competitive and provide what the customer wants, what the consumer wants, you've got to hit all those criterion, just like you always did, right? So this just happens to be the environment we're working in. Thank you.
I should have warned you in the preparation. I may jump in out of this, but very, very important point. And it's true for companies, private companies, but it is also, in my opinion, absolutely true for governments. Because if we want to build a reshore supply chain here, and what we're selling is just, I'm not sure if this thing is working, but if we want to reshore those supply chains here and our sales pitch is just we're greener, I'm sorry, it's not working. It is absolutely not going to be working. We gotta be selling, yes, access to critical minerals, but selling it as, yes, they're greener, but they're in your backyard, so your logistics is better, all of your supply chain is better. We have recycling solution. Yes, it's nice recycling, but it is also a very economically viable way of getting access to raw materials. So this is really how we gotta position ourselves, always having in mind this economic viability, and yes, using ESG as a tool to sell us being competitive. Otherwise, no way those international tier 1 companies will come to Canada.
Yeah, I think one thing, and maybe I'll put this open to whomever wants to answer, but I think one thing that can be challenging is when you look at, a lot of supply chain, if you will, moved offshore to lower cost environments from a cost perspective. So as you start to reshore these things, we are, on the one hand, I think, have stronger regulation, and I think there's a higher cost for labor, et cetera. So, what are the levers that people need to be thinking about to sort of, we're doing the right thing, we're reshoring, we're creating jobs in Canada, but how do we offset some of that from an economic viability perspective?
I can jump in, but I don't want to steal the whole thing, so I'll stop after this one. But for me, it's really about thinking out of the box. And I think we did a bit of that in Quebec, especially with the Bécancour. I think this is a very nice example of how you can actually compete with China on doing exactly what they do, but in a much greener way. And the solution, in our opinion, was actually co-location. So thinking about having all the players together so you improve logistics, you minimize OPEX, and then you become competitive. Of course, energy is also cheap and renewable in Quebec, and you gotta really account for this because it's a major point. And the other thing also is that as the government, we decided to invest taking equity positions in mining projects to secure access to raw materials and use this as an enabler also. So in China, yes, there's a full supply chain, but it's a very complex supply chain and which is not so secure from a geopolitical standpoint, geostrategical standpoint. So actually in Quebec, what we're providing is security, sustainability, and stability of supply. This is a good upside. So we gotta position ourselves as being competitive without not just doing exactly what they do, doing it a better way, but still being competitive. And I'll stop.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind adding to that. I've probably spent the bulk of time in the last 5-6 years working on geopolitical issues. And a lot of it's had to do with North America. We had a number of years where we were renegotiating the USMCA or the CUSMA or whatever you want to call it in Mexico as well. And I'm a big believer in North America regionalization. We have a few plants in China, but we never went full bore because we said, geopolitics, things change over time. And if ever something happens bad there, I want it to be a flesh wound. I'm not going to bet the company on it. And so we have a tremendous footprint in Mexico, the U.S., North, Middle, and South, and in Canada. And that's the advantage that we have. So we can deal with a lot of different things. Our cost, you can produce in Mexico cheaper than in China. It's also close, a wonderful place to do work. But we make things together in North America, and we can. So that also is a competitive advantage for us in the context of making vehicles and making parts for vehicles. And I think that as long as we can keep that border open, right? And move goods. And now I think people, because there's a paucity of employment in the United States, we've got to be able to get people from Canada and Mexico in there. Then I think we'll be tremendous, we'll do very tremendous, or make very tremendous progress. The one thing I would say, and this is new, is the United States is seeing it. And, you know, I was in Mexico at a North American conference, and, you know, they had the president there, they had the Secretary of Commerce, they had the foreign minister, and they basically said, you know what, we've got good neighbors. And so that is an advantage for us. And we say, you know, we're right across the border. And if something happens in New York State, that's good for us in Quebec, that's good for us in Ontario, and utilize that. And the industry, our industry, is extremely capable at taking advantage of those things. And the supply base is absolutely marvelous at it.
But I'll also add to that, when you're looking into new investments, right, cost is a huge piece of it, but the other side is risk. And it's true in Canada, I'd say once your facility is up and running, your risk is much lower than maybe elsewhere. But however, those 5 to 8 to 10 to 12 years that you're trying to get the permits and trying to get the approvals, you don't know. And it's hard for you to go to your stakeholders and say, well, we're still in the process. And in the previous world, I would do permitting. And to retool a facility to emit less, you're still waiting for 2 years for approvals. So I'd say that is where the risk lies. And if we can eliminate that, then you kind of got a win-win.
I was just going to add that, you know, there's what was missing in the video this morning was the whole recycling end. And I think that there is, you know, working together with different countries, different jurisdictions, but also doing the full supply chain. Because when those batteries come to end of life after 10 or 12 years, you got to do something with them. And that's part of the ESG challenge. And I think the Quebec government, you know, by encouraging the recycling and developing that whole part of the EV industry is really helping to close that chain and create that circularity of materials. And in the beginning, it may not be huge volumes, but over time, as we move to electrification, there's going to be huge volumes of material that we can source from those batteries and avoid having to build new mines. And that would be locally sourced material instead of having to go further abroad to find those materials.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that whole circularity element is something that I've seen, I would say more recently, become more part of the forefront in terms of both looking at sort of how OEMs are thinking about the sourcing of the parts and what's the end of life of this product and how do we maximize what we get out of it on the other side in an efficient way.
And also on this, and I think Lithion is a big part of that, working on this, is not just about end-of-life batteries. It's also about all of the process scrap along the value chain. And you know this, Kunal, as well from your past, but this is the big chunk of the market for at least the next 5-10 years, actually, to work on all of those supposed to be waste and actually bringing them back in the value chain and the supply chain. This is really something that is important, and you're doing this.
And that adds to the economic viability of you know, that battery manufacturing chain, because having to deal with those non-conforming products and getting them back into chain is part of economics.
And maybe Eva, just now that you're, you know, touching on sort of the whole recycling element, obviously the whole circularity piece being so important, maybe you could highlight some of the key challenges and opportunities as sort of a newer, call it startup in that perspective that you've encountered.
So for those who don't know Lithion, maybe just 30 seconds, really quick. We have a demonstration plant, a large demonstration plant in Anjou, which is in Montreal. We're in the process of building our first commercial plant for the treatment of lithium-ion batteries or lithium-ion materials. And that's under construction right now. We'll be starting up later on this year. And we're in the process of selecting a site for a hydrometallurgical plant where we'll take the materials extracted from those batteries and then make battery-grade materials to put back into the cycle. So creating that full circularity. So Lithion is new. I think the Lithion recycling angle of the EV supply chain is new as well, so it has its challenges. And some of the things we're seeing are the whole permitting regulatory framework. It's really not adapted today to circularity. It was created, a lot of those laws were created many years ago at another time, another space, and they're not quite modernized, and I think that's something that we're working on. there's also the perception of risk. So, the first years when you start a new company, how are we perceived from insurance, et cetera? That is a challenge. And although it's evolving as they get to know our new industry, as they get to know, get more familiar with our technology and what we're putting in place to manage risk, it's not quite moving fast enough. Some of the opportunities, I think there's an opportunity to do things the right way. So working with communities or working with the whole automotive industry, trying to create that confidence that recycling is a way to get critical strategic materials back into that supply chain and having that local supply. And also, I think there's a real opportunity to partner with the automotive industry in order to design and how do we access that urban mine? And then how do we design batteries in the future so that we make it easier to recycle and to extract the maximum value out of the batteries so that we're actually creating that local strategic material supply chain?
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and maybe as a former recycler helping Li-Cycle scale up and then moving on, economics, as Simon has mentioned, is critical. And 4 years ago, none of the OEMs really wanted to talk about recycling that much. They were developing their platforms. Obviously, with cobalt, nickel, lithium prices going up significantly, everybody wants to talk about recycling now. So I think that's a key piece. I agree with the sustainable supply chain. And again, to Rob's point, it's integrated with the whole North American ecosystem, not just a Canadian challenge, because in reality, all the gigafactories where the scrap's coming from, a majority of them are in the US. So a majority of the material, there's more cars in the US, there's going to be more material to bring back into the supply chain. Where you process that, whether it's Quebec or New York State, doesn't really matter because it'll go back into the same supply chain.
If I may add to this, actually, one thing that you touch a very good point here on North America, and same on you, Rob. Right now we're kind of in a competition mode in North America, to say the least. And even within Canada, I'm sorry, but Quebec, Ontario, we're competing. This is terrible. This is the worst thing we can do in the world. Honestly, do we think that China's competing internally right now? They don't do this. So we got to find a way actually to get together and work together on this. And IRA, I see this, of course, as let's say a mini wheat. There's a sugar-coated side. There's another one that is less funny. But it's we all agree on this. But still, it's an amazing opportunity. And the most important thing, actually, it is that we have no choice. It's there. So we got to work with it. And we should be working together, Canadians, with the Americans and Mexico as well, in building a real North American supply chain, something like a North American Battery Alliance. We've been talking about this for years. Let's make it happen. And recycling would need this because you got to homogenize regulations such as exactly what you were saying.
Really good point. I don't know, Rob, did you have something to add, or you looked very thoughtful?
I'm going to defer my time.
Oh, okay. You pick your place.
The audience size and relief.
Maybe we can, Kunal, we can come back to you. Just thinking about the amount of innovation happening in the industry. Obviously, our traditional automotive supply base doing lots of innovation in this new ecosystem. Maybe you can just highlight from, the new product and sort of generation of battery that you're working on, and sort of how that will contribute to an overall more sustainable supply chain.
Yeah, I think all the effort that we've taken the last 2-3 years, and Simon has done a lot of that effort, is to support the existing lithium-ion supply chain. So there's an inherent sustainability there. You're building lithium-ion batteries using low-carbon energy to build that. But I think the next phase of growth is really those individual processes themselves are not necessarily the cleanest. I think there's a comment earlier about the tons of CO2 per battery. Part of that's the energy mix, part of that's the mining, but part of it's just whether it's cathode or anode processing, or cell manufacturing, not as much, but it's more the generation of the materials. And so I think somebody in the morning made a comment, we've worked up to 2025, now we got to work up to 2030 or 2035. We really still got to think about, okay, how do we support innovation to reduce the impact of each of those processes, or use new materials in batteries that will disrupt lithium ion. I mean, there's a lot of money being invested. A lot of these gigafactories in the US will be online in 2025. The automotive groups are going to use their platforms for a number of years, but you already can start thinking about the next platforms. I would disagree with the morning comments on hydrogen. I think 10 years ago, people would say it's next decade. 20 years ago, people say it's next decade. There may be some niche applications for it, but I think there's a lot of innovation, a lot of it coming from US startups in new battery types, whether it's lithium, sulfur, solid state, or just, obviously biased with lithium metal anodes that can enable better densities, lesser material intensities. And we're working with our partner, Blue Solutions, on a later panel also about next generation anodes. And there's also new process for cathodes. The cathode process was easy to ramp up in places like China and permitting, though there's a lot of outputs like sodium sulfate. Where do you do it? A lot of it's dumped into the ocean in certain countries. So is there a better way to make cathode materials, or different cathode materials like sulfur that are ubiquitous materials that can unlock new potential in the next value chain? So we got to talk about that. Maybe not this year, but maybe next year at the conference also. Or now, but it'll continue to grow in terms of the conversation.
Because if we're not having this conversation today, somebody else will be having it. And not only will we have lost this present war of securing all of the cell manufacturing, but we'll also be missing on the next gen opportunity. So you're totally right. It has to happen today.
Yeah, and I guess I've had discussions with the Canadian government. A lot of the effort right now has been to bring POSCO, Korean company. We have Umicore, the Belgian company. So all the cathode active material side is foreign companies being supported, but there's a lot of innovation, whether it's us or others doing cathode or anode or battery innovation here, that can be supported to help compete with the new battery generation coming out of the US as well.
Yeah, it seems to me that supporting the Canadian businesses on this front seem to be the right answer. And I think this whole concept of, the whole supply chain working together all the way through to end of life, et cetera, from whether it's Canadian or North American, seems like it would be a really important factor from a competitive perspective.
Yeah. Talking about innovation and all the different things that we can do, I've talked about the strength of the Canadian supply base. Actually, Project Arrow, which someone will talk about, I'm sure, shows the capability of the Canadian supply base on all kinds of stuff. With we can basically do anything for an EV. When you're talking about batteries, I hope you're looking at putting graphene in them, because we're a shareholder of Nano Explorer, which is a great graphene company, and we think that graphene-enhanced batteries are the way to go. I think the CEO of Nano Explorer, Sarush Nazarpour, is in the audience somewhere, so I'm sure he'll introduce himself to you afterwards. But I do think that there's a lot of innovation going on where we're working with our ecosystem here. It's nice to see so many universities. Nice to be here. I've never been in this building, but man, there's a lot of good stuff going on here and some of the other institutions. It's great to see our customers like General Motors setting up engineering facilities here, and Ford in Ottawa and so forth. I think that's tremendously good, and a lot of innovation you get just by doing it. Right? You got to make stuff in order to make stuff better. So a lot of process innovation we're doing in our systems. We've got a plant that is doing artificial intelligence. It's doing robotics and mechatronics. It's using new materials. It's doing all that stuff on the line. So you can actually bring the university and the academics on the line. And as we do that, we're going to find ourselves getting really, really good at stuff that we didn't think we were good at. Right, and so in that system, I think that collaborating in that sense is very good. And I shout outs to Flavio Volpe of the APMA, and my CFO is the chair of that. So I help budget the money for it with the Project Arrow to basically show that. I think that's a real pump in the arm. And the other thing that it does is it illustrates to governments, those people that talk and attract investment from other places, that sometimes you got to look at home. And if you help with the procurement at home, then that's a good thing. We got some real smart people here. We have a lot of people come to this country as immigrants that are making a change, and we've got to utilize that talent.
Maybe just thinking maybe more broadly on ESG. So I know it's sort of talked about all the time, right? The environment. We've got rules, regulations, government. It gets a lot of attention. Governance has obviously gotten a fair bit of attention, but I find that the S part of ESG isn't talked about enough, and it also has a really big impact. So it would be interesting to hear, maybe Eva, maybe Simon, I don't know if in your travels or others, but maybe you can share some of the things from a community engagement that you have been doing and your experience there.
So far with Lithion, we've had to engage with our host communities for our first plant and our second plant. So we're actively engaging with them, and we found that generally they're very accepting of us. They really want us to come into their communities. They align with our vision, our mission as a company. And they can really identify with what we're doing. We're trying to make the world a better place, and we're trying to make the world more sustainable. And I think the Quebec and Canadian governments have done an astonishing work in terms of driving the whole electric mobility in Quebec, the whole battery strategy. So when we show up in these communities, they're looking forward to seeing us. They want to be part of that movement towards electric mobility, and they want to contribute as communities. And so we really see a lot of receptivity, and I think a lot of that has been created by the actions of the Quebec government with its whole battery strategy. However, we have to talk to them, and I think that's the most important part. So we're actively engaging with them, speaking to them, explaining what we do, how we do it, why we do it, explaining our business model, which is to license our technology. We're really a technology company. We want to license it, and that will make circularity not just accessible here, but accessible around the world through our licensing agreement. And they can really identify with that. And I think that is really that communication, that open dialogue is really the key to making sure that we do it right, and we do it in a way where we're actually contributing, so there's a win-win for every stakeholder.
And also at government level, we tend to do the mistake of thinking that it's the responsibility of the companies to do all of that. Yes, it is. It is indeed, but we have a big part, actually. And when we designed that battery strategy, it all started actually as an industry-led initiative using the industrial cluster that we have for electrification, Propulsion Quebec. Simon will be talking in the afternoon. He's an active member of that team. And it all started there and then grew up, yes, an industry-led, but then government-led, and then community-led. So in Bécancour, we really initially, before any project was even confirmed, actually we presented them a layout of black boxes saying, we are expecting to have this and this and this. So we did a lot of community engagement in the process of developing the battery strategy before there was even one public announcement. So the local communities were part of this in Bécancour, and today you don't know it, but we're also working on Saguenay, we're working on sites in the greater Montreal area, and the mayors, the elected officials, the local stakeholders are already part of the discussion, and yet nobody knows about it except them. So whenever it will be public, they will be part of it already because they would have been working on this for a year, and including the First Nations as well. So in Bécancour, I'm sure a lot of people don't know, but there's actually a First Nation living 5 kilometers away from the industrial park. They're part of it. They're partners to this battery strategy. So it helps with the permitting, it helps with everything. So, and also it helps with the timeline of developing a project. You gotta have those people on board. So to us, the S part was critical in developing this battery strategy. Where I see a challenge, however, is how to transform this proactivity into something that is worth something also for the industrials. So I did talk about timeline to put a project online. Yes, it helps. But I think one thing that is missing right now, the Europeans are doing it, and full disclosure, I'm pretty active in this. It's called the Global Battery Alliance and a battery passport, but I think we gotta use tools such as traceability to actually put light on the supply chain, not just to put light on the E, but also on the S and the G. And traceability for me is a tool that we gotta use broadly in the world, not just in Europe, in North America, to actually put light on the things that we do good here. Because right now, all of that community engagement is word full of things socially, but economically it doesn't make a difference. There's no premium for being a good corporate citizen right now on the market.
General comment on culture and then a specific example. I think the best social policy is a good job. I think government's got to remember that. And I think that at the core of that is treating your people right. Our vision statement is making people's lives better by being the best we can be in the products we make and the services we provide. There's no limit on that. We always try and be better to ourselves, but you got to take care of your people, and they got to come into work, and they got to know that they're treated with dignity and respect. Our first principle is a golden rule culture: treat people the way you want to be treated, and people feel that every day. And if you do that, that's a sustainable comparative advantage for your company. And we do that, and we live it every day. And we lived it in COVID, where I'll make 3 quick examples. One is we ended up making ventilator stands with General Motors. We became the world's largest ventilator stand maker. We made masks, level 3 masks for our people, made 10 million masks, gave them to governments and so forth, and our people were all part of that. I want all our people that, very often when they work at one of our factories, it's one of the largest employers in town, and I want them to be proud that they work there. And one of the things we did on the social side with respect to giving, and a lot of companies will appreciate this, you're always hit up for money, for donations, for hospitals and stuff like that. And it generally works pretty well, and someone like me gets to write a check, and we get to go to a dinner, and we say nice things, and people clap, and the people on the floor, quite frankly, couldn't give a shit. And so what we do is we say, look, we give money to charities, et cetera. What we're going to do is figure out how much the plant gives and what's an appropriate amount and so forth. And all plants are involved in their communities. And what we're going to do is basically designate an amount per employee, and you pick where it goes. And we'll do it by project by project. We partnered with a company called Give Some. We've actually made a strategic investment in it to basically say, you tell us where it's going to go. And the interesting thing about this is you can measure it. And what happens when the project is done is you get a little video on your phone that shows what it went for. And it's incredibly touching that you make a difference every day. And so that's one of the ways that we relate to our people. But at the end of the day, I would say, in terms of ESG, all business is social, first and foremost. If you can do that for your people, then you've got a good business.
Yeah, go ahead, Ahmed.
Yeah, I think a couple of points that Ava and Simon kind of touched on for working with community that I think are very similar and same principles as working with our supply chain. So for most of us, our companies, our scope 3 emissions is going to be about 60 to 80, maybe 90% of our emissions. And when we're signing on to all of these commitments, we're going to have to drastically reduce that. So we're seeing a lot of commitments out there that haven't been thought out or have not been done in consultation with the company that actually now needs to reduce their emissions for you to meet your goal. So I think that is a critical piece, to have that conversation with your suppliers and what is achievable and what is the glide path to get there. And it's the same on the S side. I think a lot of it right now is driven by a lot of the regulations out of Europe, but I think it's getting companies to start thinking, oh, maybe I should know a bit more about my supply chain. I should have a good map of where my raw materials are coming from. So I think we're starting to see a lot of that, driven, yes, by regulation, but a company, once we're at that table, we're looking much beyond what is the bare minimum.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, the supply chain in automotive is quite a large web, right? And so I think the degree of transparency and sort of helping people meet these goals, I think is going to be also really, it's going to be an important factor for sure. Maybe, Kunal, we can come back to you. Just thinking from a supply chain perspective, you've got a new sort of business starting up. What does the future look like for this business as it scales up?
Yeah, so for clarity, we have 2 parts to the business. One is making lithium metal. So it's for next generation batteries, converting a lithium carbonate chemical into a solid metal. That in itself is better than the existing processes. They use lithium chloride predominantly in China. There's a lot of chlorine gas byproducts. So that's where the innovation comes in. And the second piece is actually taking that lithium and making it into an anode of the battery. So essentially getting it onto a copper foil so it can go into a battery. So, those are our key inputs, lithium and copper. The lithium side, when we go to customers and you try to sell an anode, they say, where's the metal coming from? And then if you say, we're going to make the metal in North America, then they say, where's the carbonate going to come from? So there's always one step back that customers, and we see that the groups developing these batteries in North America want to know about. And the good thing for us is that we're going to scale into commercial and scale in the next 2 to 3 years. And there is a lot of supply coming online, whether that's in Canada or North America in general, of the carbonate. Otherwise, if you wanted to build the plant today, you would have to probably buy carbonate from overseas. But that's part of this building this complete supply chain, is that there's a lot of work that's been done to help support that. On the copper side, I guess a lot of the foil supply is also overseas, but and maybe that's a point nobody ever touches on, is that we talk about the nickel, cobalt, lithium, but nobody ever really talks about electrolyte, copper foil, and some of these. I know Redwood in the US is doing some recycled copper foil, but so there's some other ignored pieces within the battery also that need to be reshored.
We now have a copper foil project in Quebec.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, it was announced just recently with a Korean company setting foot in Quebec for copper foil and building on the recycling. So 100% of the supply chain for that copper foil business will be actually recycling, coming from recycling, because we have also this sometimes not so famous Glencore Oring facility. That is the largest recycler of copper. So this is actually something, you're totally right, because the question was asked. It's nice that you're planning on doing anode materials, but what about all the rest? So we got to tackle all those other parts of the supply chain, and always having in mind, how can we be competitive and green at the same time? Thus being, as you said, really sustainable, so economically viable.
I think we're getting to 20 minutes, and I know we want to save some time for Q&A. I have to confess, so I'm an accountant by background, and so I have one question. Having spent almost 30 years working in the automotive space as an auditor accountant, I know that the industry is so competitive that scraping bits of margin are always very important to kind of get that down to the bottom line, and the customers are tough negotiators, and so when you think about what I've traditionally seen as a lot of investment decisions being based on what's my return on capital, how quick is my payback, and so when you look at now some of the other decisions that are being made that might be around sustainability sort of measures, how do those non-financial impacts get factored into decision making, and is there anything that you're thinking or changing as you make decisions now that you may not have made 10 years ago? 5.
I would say no. Business is business, and you got to take care of your people as part of business. And I've been involved with a number of businesses, and those that take care of their people find that, they don't leave. They don't leave even if you're not paying them as much as the next recruiter's trying to pay or whatever. You have got to create a great environment for employees where they are masters of their profession, where they're given a certain amount of autonomy, and where they believe they have purpose in what they do. And so, it sounds general, but it works. At the same time, you've got to be able to make money. Our culture is basically on 3 stools, and different people do it different way. But the first one is the golden rule culture, right at the center of it. And if you've got people that want to come to work, that's a way to do it. There are 2 other aspects. One is lean. And, everyone hears that. They think of Toyota. Our CEO ran Toyota's largest plant in the world in Ohio, which is now the largest plant in the world. We have a number of people there. But basically, it doesn't mean take cost out. It means take out waste. Take out waste, be able to see what you can do, streamline everything. And that means that, you can make money and you can spend it on parties if that's what you want for employees to make them feel good or whatever. But you have to be able to take out waste. And so that's what lean means to us. And our other is entrepreneurial. We started, with a number of entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs think differently. But the key aspect of that is own what you do. Have your people own what you do. You can have inspectors at the end of the line, or you got people make the parts that really care, so that you don't have to have inspectors at the end of the line. And if you can do that, that's very good. But that means you've got to, in a business that on the one hand moves slowly, but at the same time has to pivot quickly, that is a way to look at it. And so one of the things that we do, and Magna's done this, and Linamar's done it, and maybe that's why we've grown so much, is every general manager of a plant is basically the president of that plant, with responsibility for the bottom line, with compensation tied to that. And we say, okay, so if you're not servicing the customer, it's going to affect your comp. If you have too many people, it's going to affect your comp. If you have too few people, you're going to affect your comp. If you've got too much machines, you're going to do that. So that person is thinking like an owner, the same as, a corner store, right? And so in that context, you put those 3 together, and when it's operating well, it operates extremely well. And then if you apply that thinking when you're looking to make investments, which includes strategic investments or partnering with people, et cetera, then you find that a lot of opportunities open up themselves to you. We've gone from 0 to 5 billion in 20 years. Seems to have worked. We've done some acquisitions, some strategic investments, some greenfield plants, but that works for us. And then because it does, at the end of the day, our margins are top quartile in our business, which I think it's a report card. But it's also something we need to think about in order to be sustainable. And yes, customers are tough, but at the end of the day, competition just makes you tougher.
That's fair. Sure. Ahmed?
Yeah, well, I can add to that too. I think it's, as I mentioned earlier, right? Another big piece of ESG is that risk. So when we were looking at our supply chain, and we were putting in these requirements for what is like a responsible ESG supply chain and suppliers and partners to work with, yes, sometimes it might mean eventually you will need to cut off a supplier if they don't meet the bare minimum. But I think there's an important piece to remember that as long as that you do have a robust glide path to help your suppliers get to where they need to be, and you're truly working with them to improve their scores and remove those red flags, then it's a win-win. But you might have a couple that are kind of still holding back. I think you got to ask yourself some tough questions at the end of the day. And it might mean, do you want to work with a supplier who, for example, can't prove that they've got an ethical labor force, that they can't prove that their employees don't work 120 hours a week, or got forced labor? And then you got to ask yourself, is that a partner that you want to be connected with, not just from an ethical standpoint, but from risk and quality? What kind of work are you going to be getting for the long run? So I think these are kind of strategic long-term decisions that you're going to have to do some soul searching and to make a decision on.
I really like that point, for sure.
I was going to add that I don't think, piggybacking on what Marissa West was saying this morning in terms of customers and, they want to be able to plug their cars, et cetera. But I also think that, economics is important. How much does the car cost is important to any consumer. However, I don't think they're willing to move to electric mobility at all costs. So there's the social and environmental costs that I think people are very sensitive to. And being able to prove that we're doing things sustainably, that we're doing things with local supply, that we're taking care of the whole life cycle of a product, I think those are all elements that, we're moving along this electric mobility. It's not going to stop. That's where we're headed. There's a lot of, government regulations that are pushing us there. But I think consumers also want to make sure that we're doing it intelligently and sustainability, and obviously economically viable as well.
And on this, for me, this is all about traceability. That's what it needs. Every battery should be having some kind of battery passport to actually create that premium on the market for being ESG compliant. So for me, that's kind of the solution. And I think a lot of people have actually understood this because it's happening in Europe. It's starting also to happen. I don't know if you've seen Senator Tonko from New York, and I think Senator from Ohio are working right now on the regulation in the U.S. For sourcing of materials through traceability and some kind of battery passport in which they would be integrating carbon footprint. So it is even happening in the U.S. And it will be happening globally. But also, I think to your question, switching hats, because at Investissement Québec, for those who knows us, we have like so many hats, but one of them is also being an investor, because all of those projects we support. And our payback is not our payback on investing in GM, investing in POSCO or the others. The payback is long-term fiscal revenues. For me, ESG is risk management. That's what it is. So a company that comes to me and is not talking about what Kunal was talking about, which is cleaner processes, which is not talking about views on the supply chain, really understanding it, for me, that's a risk as an investor, because down the road in 20 years, that's a major, major problem potentially. So ESG from an investment standpoint, as a responsible investor, for me is a must. So that also creates additional value for the companies.
That's great. So I think we're getting close to time for Q&A, but obviously it's been, a great conversation. I think certainly Canada, has a strong automotive supply chain, a very strong industry, and I think, from things that have been highlighted today and earlier in the discussions, I think even, there are a lot of competitive advantages that we do have. I think there is this need for everybody to work together in a very collaborative and coordinated way to really, realize on that value that we can provide more broadly. Maybe just turn it to, maybe we'll go in a row just to change it. What are your thoughts in terms of what the future holds as Canada's place from a global automotive perspective? Sort of any final thoughts you might have?
Yeah, I think the historic automotive supply chain and the platform we've built with lithium ion is a good stepping stone to really being a very active player, I think, in the future. And I guess Canada doesn't always have to build the cars. We can build the other pieces for it, whether it's parts for batteries or parts for seats. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to be a part of the next generation of vehicles.
Yeah, I would say we've got all the right building blocks, but it's kind of, we got to put them together. So we've got the clean energy, we've got the workforce, we've got the innovation, we've got manufacturing, but how do we make sure all of these pieces are talking to each other? I think that's kind of the best way forward.
For me, I think, and for us in Quebec, I think it's all of the above, everything that was said. But there's one thing I think we're missing right now is that we're not selling this thing to the Canadian population. Everybody in this room is already totally sold to what we've been saying. But my father doesn't know what we do. My uncle doesn't. My aunt doesn't. And this is a problem. Actually, we haven't sell this thing as a society project, and we need to make it this way. In Quebec, we're trying to do this. We're talking about this James Bay of the 21st century, and we're trying to sell it globally in the population so people get on board. And it relates also to your question on community engagement. But I think Canada, we got to do a lot of nation building on this thing. And we have to sell this battery strategy globally within Canada as a project for the entire society. Yeah.
So I agree with everything that's been said here. I just like to say that, I agree that we have to work collaboratively. However, collaboratively doesn't mean really, really slowly. So we have to create a sense of urgency. I mean, the automakers, the whole industry is kind of positioning itself right now. Big decisions are being made. And if you're not in the game right now, it's going to pass you by. And the time it takes to do things in Canada is excruciating slow. And does that mean throwing all our laws and regulations out the door? No, but I think we can find ways to be more efficient, to work collaboratively, but to work with a sense of urgency that we need to get things going. And even if we don't know all the answers, we don't know everything, you got to start going, because as you said, once you start doing it, that's when the innovation comes in and we get better at what we're doing. But if we don't start, we'll never get there.
Yeah, don't let progress get in the way of perfection get in the way of progress, right? Rob?
So to be different, I disagree with everything that was said. No, just kidding. Really, really tremendous information that I've learned on this panel. But I would leave people with this. We're talking about EVs and everything else, and I happen to sit as co-chair of CAPSI, which is the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. It represents all the OEMs, all the suppliers, Unifor, dealers, and it has the ministers of industry of Quebec, Ontario, and federally on it. So we collaborate, we have those discussions. And there's three things to remember in the context of the EV revolution. One is consumers got to buy the product, and it's more expensive right now. And so in the States, you've talked about subsidies. The issue is how much. But right now, effectively, EVs, for the most part, are second vehicles for people with a lot of money. That's a reality. So you got to change that so that people will have as choice. I like EVs, I've driven them, but that is a general issue, and there's a cost benefit to that in terms of how much money you're willing to subsidize an industry. The second one is you need infrastructure, and infrastructure numbers that the federal government's talking about are 10% of what you really need. They say 84,000 charging stations work well. The industry says 1.2 million to 1.4 million. And you can't use studies from California where they have the same number of people as us, but it's warmer in a smaller area. So you need the infrastructure, and that's going to take time. And that doesn't just come out of nowhere. So as far as that goes, that is also going to slow, both those things are going to slow the adoption of EVs. And the third one is the industry has to make money. We live in a free and democratic society. We're not state-owned industries that say this is what you got to make. And that's true with the OEMs, and that's true with the suppliers. So the EV rollout is not going to match what the federal government puts out for 2026. Those vehicles are already made, and quite frankly, why subsidize stuff that's not made in Canada? So you got a political issue. It is aspirational, it works, And I do think there's tremendous opportunity, and it's going to go, and this industry is so bloody large that, 10% penetration is huge. It's going to fuel a lot of innovation. But let's also recognize that people are going to react with cost-benefit analysis. There's a reality out there. We're going to find solutions to other things. We're going to find other ways to decarbonize and stuff like that. And so just because something is on a trend line that goes a particular way today, that might not be the way tomorrow. And Linda mentioned that with hydrogen cells, which you can have a debate about, but we don't necessarily know where everything is. I do believe, and I recommend this to everybody, read a book called How the World Really Works by Vaclav Smil. Because at the end of the day, that is how the world really works. I think in 25 years we'll have as much carbon as we do now, but at the same time, we'll find different ways to deal with it. And that's the beauty of the entrepreneurial innovator that we have a lot of in this country. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we've got some time now for Q&A. If there are any questions. Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you. It's Wissam Saadi from York Region Economic Development Department. Maybe a question maybe to Rob and to Ahmed. In terms of, both like tier ones and OEMs have capabilities, financial, technical, engineering to shift to manage this transition. But what about like tier twos and tier three suppliers? How would they be able to deal with that transition? Thank you.
The transition to carbon-free, to like decarbonization?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think we're in the manufacturing space, so it's the same tools that an OEM would use. I come from an OEM just recently. But yeah, it's looking at our manufacturing, looking at how do we retool our operation. Decisions that are being made today are going to affect our emissions for the next 25 to 50 years, right? That's the lifespan of a paint oven. So it's taking a look at our capex. It's taking a look at where our new divisions being located, where are the sources of energy, what is going to be the cost for that division to be carbon free, and then that's all part of the decision making. So I would say it's quite similar to an OEM, and we're located always right next to them. So geographically, it's quite similar.
Yeah, I think the other aspect was tier twos and tier threes. They're going to get crushed. A lot of them are basically not going to be in business. And you're going to see new tier twos and tier threes as you go. I think there's going to be consolidation. We look at teasers that come in from time to time, and you can talk to a lot of investment bankers and so forth. And I probably get 2 a day. And that is a reality. I think a lot of people are saying, I've been in this business for a while. Do I want to be in another business? Which is kind of what it is for a number of them. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's similar. Obviously, you still have structure in a vehicle. The EV part is a propulsion system and so forth, and you're still going to need paint, and you're going to need things like that. But that is a big issue for a lot of people. And quite frankly, for a lot of people, it's hard to, quote, decarbonized. We get it, and all that type of stuff. So I think that, in the context of dealing with carbon, we're going to find solutions to carbon as opposed to necessarily supply chain. We have to, because at the end of the day, carbon's not going away. I answered 3 different questions at the same time, but your focus.
A master.
But your focus is the tier 2s and tier 3s, and a lot of people are saying, "Do I want to be in this business?"
I think we have another question up front here. Oh, over here. Sorry, blinding lights.
Hi, David Adams from the Global Automakers of Canada. So more for Simon and Eva. Simon, good to see you again. So the question of recyclability of batteries is an interesting one, and it's also an important one. And Simon, you had indicated that we need a more sort of holistic, comprehensive strategy, because what we don't need is different provinces and jurisdictions fighting over battery recycling, nor do we need a regulatory environment that drives, I guess, different provincial industrial policies. And, we had a good example of that in Quebec, for instance, where we had proposed extended producer responsibility regulations that effectively would have required manufacturers to take vehicles off of the road to meet the recycling mandate, if you wanted to call it that. So I think what we really do need is a comprehensive approach to this, and a recognition that most manufacturers warrant their batteries for 8 years. The reality is they'll probably last longer. Then there's a secondary use application once a battery gets below 80%. So I think we just need to ensure that our industrial development policy is aligned with our environmental policy as well. And we probably need some federal oversight to ensure that, there's some rationality, I suppose, to battery recycling. We probably need a recycler out west, maybe one in Ontario, maybe one in Quebec or the east, but we don't need every province everywhere. There's not going to be enough throughput to feed those stocks. So just comments on that if you would.
I fully agree. Quebec made a mistake. Maybe for the first time, politicians agreed with it and agreed also to revert the decision. So I was truly happy with this. It was a decision made by the Minister of Environment without talking to the battery team, essentially the battery strategy. So the total disconnect that you're mentioning between industrial policy, environmental policy was there. And we were, I think, wise enough to notice it and turn it back. And you're totally right. The solution is about integrating, creating an integrated North American value chain of recycling, building on this spoken up model of recycling where you have collection of materials, then black mass production, then you move it to hydromet facilities. Li-Cycle was working on the same model. I think that this is the solution. But in order to be able to do this, you're totally right. We cannot have one regulation for every state, every provinces. It has to be a common regulation, developed with the industry, aligned with the industrial policy that actually feed that market with complying with strictest environmental standards.
Yeah, and maybe to add to a couple comments, since I was in recycling, one is there is a recycler in BC, there is one in Ontario, and there is one in Quebec. So we're already pretty advanced actually compared to the US, because if you look at North America, half the recycling companies are basically Canadian. And I think it's actually just economically driven. I've seen that the German OEMs, for example, it's ingrained in their sort of business model because they have to do it in Europe, they want to do it here. And then in North America, they want to do it because there's a lot of value in the nickel and cobalt if they get a battery back in warranty. And then, afterlife, you can debate another panel on second life versus not, or where do the vehicles actually go to die? That's more of a, I think, challenge in Europe because often the vehicles would move from Central Europe to Eastern Europe to Africa. I think here most of the vehicles die within North America, so we would have the battery somewhere to recycle.
Great. Well, I think we're at time. I think it's been great talking to our panelists here. I know from my perspective, certainly, it's a great industry that we do have here. I am optimistic about our ability to sort of work together and, come together as a country to, really make a mark from a global automotive perspective. So, thanks.